get right into it. Tonight we are covering waders and game birds. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Catherine Dale. I'm the Newfoundland Atlas Coordinator. And with me tonight is Jenna McDermott, who is the Assistant Atlas Coordinator. And both of us work for an organization called Birds Canada, which many of you may be familiar with. But for those of you that aren't, we are Canada's voice for birds. So we are the leading science-based bird conservation organization in Canada. And our mission is to advance the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds and their habitats. Obviously, that's a pretty big job in a country as large as Canada. And the way that we work to do this largely is through citizen science programs. So we engage the skills and supports of volunteers across the country to go out and collect data. And I just realized I did not correct the number on this slide. So it should say each year, more than 70,000 volunteers nationwide participate in Birds Canada programs, which is kind of a mind-blowing number when you think about it. So from all across the country, people are going out and participating in our numerous programs. We're relative newcomers here to Newfoundland, so we established an office here only in 2019. And at the moment, we are running two programs here in Newfoundland. The first, the really big program that we're running, is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And we will do a webinar solely devoted to the Atlas later on in this series. But for now, in brief, what it is an attempt to map out the distribution and the abundance of all of the species of birds which breed on the island of Newfoundland. So we've divided this island up into these little 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer squares, which you can see in the map on the right there. And in each of those squares, we're looking to see if a species has been found and how sure we are it's breeding there. So this particular map is for the spotted sandpiper, which you can see in the picture there, with the dark red squares showing places where we know it's breeding, the orange squares showing places where we think it's probably breeding, and the yellow square is showing places where it's been found and it's possible that it's breeding. So we're going to do that for each one of our approximately 170 species. Plenty to keep us busy, along with all of our volunteers. And the second program we run is a nocturnal owl survey, and that's actually coming up pretty soon. So this is a different kind of survey. It's very restricted in time each year. So we run the nocturnal owl survey from the 1st of April to the 15th of May each spring. But it is a long-term survey. So while the Atlas only goes on for 5 years, the nocturnal owl survey will continue ad infinitum, hopefully. And what volunteers do when they participate in the nocturnal owl survey is they go out and they survey a predetermined route of 10 stops, just one night between the 1st of April and the 15th of May. And so what you do is you play owl playback and you listen to see which owls you might detect. And it's a great survey for beginners because we really don't have that many nocturnal owls here in Newfoundland. So it's a great way to get started. We're always looking for volunteers for both of these programs. So if you're interested in volunteering, you can check them out on our website, or you can get in touch with us at nlatlas@birdscanada.org. And finally, before we get going tonight, just like to take a moment to thank all of the partners and sponsors in the Atlas project. It's a huge project. It definitely takes a village, and we would not be able to offer programs like this one if it weren't for all of the funders, supporters, and partners. And then finally, I would just like to acknowledge that the lands where we are conducting the Breeding Bird Atlas and the Nocturnal Owl Survey are the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose people have been erased forever. Additionally, the island of Newfoundland is the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq people. These people have been protecting and stewarding the land here since time immemorial. And through the work of our Breeding Bird Atlas and our Nocturnal Owl Survey, we hope to contribute to this stewardship and the effort to protect all the species we share the island with. Birds Canada understands that Indigenous voices, knowledge, and ongoing work on the land are critical for wild birds to thrive in sustainable ecosystems. We support the needs, aspirations, and rights of Indigenous peoples to care for the land. And if you're interested in learning about the ancestral lands that you live on, you can check out this website, nativeland.ca. It's a great place to start. Okay, so on with the program here. So we are going to talk today about waders. So we're going to talk about herons, rails, and shorebirds. We don't have that many herons or rails here in Newfoundland, but we've got lots and lots of shorebirds. And then we're going to talk about game birds, which are mainly grouse and ptarmigan. Traditionally, geese get grouped in with this group. It's not necessarily the best place to put geese, but in the interest of including them somewhere in this whole series, this is where we're going to talk about them today. And for those of you who've been at previous sessions, you will recognize that we focus on the birds that breed here in Newfoundland. You can probably tell that the hint there is this little X-rated photo. These birds are mating, these greater yellowlegs. So we are a breeding bird atlas. We're really interested in the birds that are here in the summer. So that's the plumage we're going to focus on, and those are the species we're going to focus on. All right, so we will start with the herons. The first one I want to talk about is an American bittern. It's a medium-sized heron, so it's not as big as, say, the great blue heron you may be familiar with. It's actually relatively common in Newfoundland, but it is a solitary shy bird. It likes marshy areas, and they like to nest on the ground amid dense vegetation. And they're actually really, really hard to spot. So even though you'd think a bird this size would be pretty easy to see, these bold stripes down the neck here, they act as camouflage. So when the birds strike a concealment pose, which is like this, they have their neck outstretched and their bill pointed towards the sky, they actually vanish really easily amongst dense vegetation. And so this is a great example of a bird that it is much, much easier to hear than see. So bitterns make a very distinctive sound. It's a deep, gulping, humperlunk sound. And to do this, the male gulps air to inflate his esophagus and then uses the stored air to make the call. And it's a very low frequency call, so it carries very well through the dense vegetation of marshes. Because marshes tend to absorb high frequency sounds, but you can hear bitterns from a long way away. So I have shared the sound on my computer, and we are going to try to play the bittern call for you, because many of you may not have seen a bittern, but I wouldn't be surprised if you recognize the call. So to me, it always sounds like water kind of going down a full tub of water going down a drain. It is very distinctive. For those of you who are here in St. John's, if you go out to Bidgood Park, there's one that lives by the river there, and you will often hear it making this sound. And I'll just add that because, as I said, it's often very much easier to hear birds than it is to see them. There are actually a number of sound files in today's talk. And all of these have been downloaded from a website called xenocanto.org. Jenna, maybe you could put that in the chat for us. It's a free online database of bird recordings. So all of the birds that we're talking about the sound from today, those are birds with very, very distinctive songs or sounds. And there are birds with much less distinctive songs and sounds. And if you want to learn a little bit more about birding by ear, then you can join us for the last webinar of this series, when Jenna is going to teach us a little bit about how you learn to bird by ear. But suffice it to say, your ears are invaluable tools when you are birding. The other heron that we have here is the great blue heron. It's our largest, heaviest heron, and it is widespread in North America. So its range extends across the continent. And typically within its range, it's really common, but Newfoundland is actually the exception to that. It's rare throughout most of the island, with the exception of the southwest corner of the province around the Codroy Valley, where there's a small breeding population. And you may notice if you come to all of these webinars that is a common theme here. The southwest corner of the island tends to have more species and more of these rare species than the rest of the island. So our breeding population here is about 10 to 20 pairs, or at least that's what it was in 2018, and it's in the Codroy Valley. So with the great blue heron, you've got this big orange-yellow spear of a bill, a long neck, a grayish-blue body. You've got dark plumes on the back of the head and shaggy plumes on the back and the neck, and they forage standing upright. They eat fish, so they stand tall in shallow water and they forage there. And they nest in colonies, often with other species of wading birds. And they build nests in trees. And so you would think that a huge bird sitting in a giant stick nest in a tree would be very noticeable. But it turns out that great blue herons are actually very good at keeping their nesting colonies a secret. Even though the herons forage in water, the colonies may be located in forests several kilometers away from water. And so it's kind of funny, it took quite a while before great blue herons were listed as a breeding species here in Newfoundland, because even though people were seeing them, no one could figure out where they were nesting. So it took quite a while to find the nesting colonies. There really aren't many species that you will mistake for a great blue heron, particularly in flight here in Newfoundland. It usually flies with its neck tucked in, but sometimes it is outstretched. So you see, there it is with the neck all tucked in, and you see these black flight feathers along the edge of the wing there. I do, however, just want to mention this guy. So we really, Jenna's laughing at me because I got so excited about this bird this summer. So we really only have those 2 species of herons here in Newfoundland. But we do sometimes get other fun visitors, and this is one that we've had a couple times in the past few years. This is a tricolored heron. This particular one showed up in Cape Friels in May 2021 and was photographed by Kayleen Stagg of the Indian Bay Ecosystem Corporation. And it was a very cool sighting. It's a beautiful species of heron, and the range of this species stops far south of Newfoundland. So tricolored herons are found in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic coast of the States, but not in Canada at all. So it was an unusual visitor. A whole bunch of birders immediately headed out to Cape Friels where it was reported, but nobody saw it again. Birds are tricky that way. However, this past summer, another tricolored heron was reported at the top of the Great Northern Peninsula in St. Anthony. We happened to be up there this summer, so I actually got a chance to see this one myself, which was very exciting. It's smaller than a great blue heron, and it's darker. So they're both kind of grayish blue, but this one is a much darker grayish blue than the great blue heron. There's also a little bit of purple on it and some white plumage. All in all, they look fairly different than great blue herons. So this is just a little plug to keep your eyes open when you're out birding in Newfoundland, because we do get some really exciting vagrant species, and you never know what you might find. Okay, now we're moving on to our rails. And again, rails are not a thing that we have a lot of here in Newfoundland. I'll start with this species, the Sora, which is very distinctive. It's small, it's about the size of a quail, and it's, again, one of those species, this is very common with marsh bird species, that is much easier to hear than it is to see. It's the most abundant and widespread rail in North America, but it is a rare breeder in Newfoundland. That being said, it can regularly be found in some of our marshes. So there are at least 2 marshes here in St. John's where Soras regularly show up. So the thing that you are looking for, if you happen to see a Sora, you're seeing a gray face with a black mask, and you're seeing this stout yellow bill that it looks a little bit like candy corn that you get at Halloween. According to the Cornell All About Birds website, Soras walk like a chicken that has had too much coffee, by which they mean that it nervously flicks its tail a lot and exposes those white feathers below the tail. These guys, again, much more likely to be heard than seen, and the most commonly heard call is a loud descending whinny, a little bit like a horse. To me, what it sounds like is somebody in the middle of an awkward situation at a party laughing slightly hysterically to diffuse the situation. So males and females whinny to defend their territory and to keep in touch with each other. And we'll see if I can play that here. All right, we'll do it this way. So yeah, I think it really does sound like somebody slightly hysterically trying to get out of an awkward party situation. It's also worth noting that Soras make a second type of call. So they make a 2-noted curwee or Sora. So they say their name. But the most common one you'll hear is that descending whinny. Our second rail here, again, a small secretive marsh bird. It's specially adapted to pushing through the dense vegetation of the marshes where it lives. So by that, I mean it has long toes, it has a very flexible back, and it has forehead feathers that are adapted to reduce wear and tear because it uses its head to push through the sharp marsh vegetation. Virginia rails are very rare breeders in Newfoundland. They like freshwater marshes with a lot of emergent vegetation. Sadly, they're not big bog dwellers, and mostly what we have here is bogs. It's also worth noting, on the off chance that you happen to find a Virginia rail nest, this species builds dummy nests. So some bird species will actually build extra nests. So they have multiple nests, but only have eggs in one as a predator avoidance strategy. So if you happen to find a Virginia rail nest, keep that in mind, but I wouldn't worry too much about remembering that fact. So for these guys, you see a reddish bill instead of the bright yellow bill of the Sora. They have a cinnamon kind of rufous neck. On the flank, you've got black and white barring, and they have a gray cheek. And of course, this is another bird you're much more likely to hear than see. It's really, really good at vanishing into vegetation. And it's perhaps best known for its calls, which are pig-like grunts, trailing off to the end, that are actually performed in duets by males and females to defend territories and communicate with each other. So we'll see if we can play that one. All right, so now we've made it through our herons and our rails. We're going to talk about shorebirds. So when we say shorebirds, it encompasses several families of birds that come in many shapes and sizes, but they all share some physical and behavioral traits. So they like open shoreline habitat. They are carnivores, although not perhaps in the traditional sense you'd think about carnivores. You certainly won't see them really pouncing on small mammals. But they do eat insects, they eat mollusks, they eat crustaceans, so they do a lot of probing in the mud and water. And they all have round heads and long legs. But the ID cues that you want to use when you're trying to tell between shorebirds is to look at the shape and the structure of the species. So how long is the bill? What shape is it? How long are the legs? What are the overall body proportions? And also the habitat choice and their feeding behaviors. We're really looking at two families here today that have representatives in Newfoundland. So we're first of all going to talk about the plovers. And these are small to medium shorebirds, and these silhouettes here are plovers. They've got short, sharp bills that taper at the end, so very short pointed bills. And they've got a short neck, or in some cases almost no neck, and a short tail. And they use their eyes to locate their prey. So because of this, they tend to have a very stop, start, run when they are foraging. So you can see them run a little bit, stop, look around, run again. And the heads of many species of plovers are strongly marked. And this is in contrast to the sandpipers, they have a wider size range. So you've got very small sandpipers, but you've also got very large sandpipers. They have longer bills. They're thin also, and they're rounded at the tip rather than tapered. And they've got nerves at the tip of this bill to feel for food while they probe the ground. So they locate food with their bill as opposed to with their eyes. All right, so starting with the plovers, perhaps the most common one, certainly the one that I learned first, was the killdeer. It's a common and widespread shorebird, but again, it's a rare breeder here in Newfoundland. And Newfoundland is in fact not included on standard maps of killdeer range. It likes open ground, but despite what I just said about shorebirds liking shorelines, killdeer don't actually need to be by water. So you can find them on lawns, on golf courses, on athletic fields. And the things that you want to look out for. So this is a tall, slender shorebird, and it's got a fairly long tail, particularly for a plover. It's got this double breast band, which you can see there, and that is unique. So it is diagnostic. If you see two breast bands, it is a killdeer. However, the young killdeer actually have just a single breast band. So if you're looking at a chick, it's harder to tell apart. So you've got a white breast and belly as well, brownish back and wings, and then you've got an orange rump, which you can just see in that picture there. And when I first heard somebody mention a killdeer, my mental image was of exactly the kind of carnivorous bird you maybe had in mind. So huge bird of prey that could swoop down and take out a deer. But it turns out this is not the case. The killdeer are actually named after the call they make almost incessantly. They've also been called the chattering plover and the noisy plover by 18th century naturalists. So males make this call constantly while they conduct display flights. And if you hear it, you can't find the bird, try looking up. So I'll play that for you. Okay. And something else I just wanted to touch on with killdeer. This, in fact, was a killdeer living at a golf course. I mentioned, or actually I didn't mention, but I meant to mention that shorebirds don't so much build a nest as just kind of plop their eggs on the ground. They're pretty lazy when it comes to building a nest. Most of them will make sort of a scrape in the ground and plop their eggs in there. And so the eggs tend to be really, really camouflaged, so that that's pretty much their only defense against predators. And the birds themselves are often very camouflaged. But if camouflage isn't working, they do have another tactic, and that is called a distraction display. So it's something that they do for predators, and the adults basically fake having a broken wing, or two wings in some cases, to draw the predator away from the nest. So they sort of limp along, making a big deal about their injury, and look like they're easy prey. But then as you're led away from the nest, they will suddenly miraculously recover and fly away. So this particular killdeer was giving me a distraction display because it had laid its eggs in the flower bed that I happened to be standing beside. So if you're interested in the atlas, one of the really cool things about it is that we focus not just on what species a bird is, but also on behavior and the kinds of behaviors that can be proof that an animal is breeding without actually having to find a nest with eggs or young birds. So something like a shorebird distraction display is actually confirmed proof of breeding, because there's really no other reason for a shorebird to be doing that except to draw you away from a nest. All right, so our next plover is the semi-palmated plover. They look a little bit like a miniature killdeer, so they are much smaller than the killdeer. But remember I said the double breast band of a killdeer is diagnostic. These guys only have one breast band. It was hard to find a good picture of a semi-palmated plover, and you can't see all the ID cues on this picture, but I did have to include it because of the adorable shorebird chick that's in it. So if you ever happen to be lucky enough to see shorebird chicks, I'm sure you will agree that they are among the cutest things in the world. So semi-palmated plovers mainly breed in the Arctic, but their range does include Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. This is also a name that confused me, like the killdeer, but semi-palmated just means that these birds have webbing between their toes for only part of the length of the toe. So they don't have fully webbed feet. They have palmated or partly palmated or partly divided feet. And there is also a semi-palmated sandpiper, but that does not breed in Newfoundland. So cues for the semi-palmated plover. You have a black crown and eye patch, a stubby orange and black bill, again, a little bit like candy corn, round head and a short neck, and a single breast band. So something you can think of with semi-palmated plovers, you can think of the adult as having black driving goggles and a scarf. They also have yellow legs, although you can't see that in this picture. And I just wanted to put up this map. As I said, we are making breeding evidence maps for all of the species here in Newfoundland. And this was current as of December 2022. So we don't have all that much breeding evidence yet for the semi-palmated plover. So hopefully now that you guys recognize them, you'll be able to contribute to this map if you come across breeding semi-palmated plovers. Our next species of plover, it's another small plover, and superficially, it may look similar to the semi-palmated plover. So you will find these guys along shorelines, and there are populations along the Atlantic coast, in the Great Lakes, and in the Great Plains. They forage alone or in small groups, which is a little bit unlike other shorebirds, and they tend to stay a little bit farther away from the water's edge. So they nest in the soft stand away from the water, the piping plover does. So cues for the piping plover, you've got a dark headband there, a sandy gray back. You have a breastband like the semi-palmated plover, but it's narrower and it may be incomplete, and you have orange legs. And its sandy gray back actually makes it a master of camouflage on the beaches, because when they crouch down in, say, a tire track or a footprint, they can almost entirely disappear. I wanted to just take a minute to compare these two species because they are very similar and it would be easy to mistake them. So when you're looking at color, you see that there's quite a color difference between the semi-palmated and the piping plover. The semi-palmated is much darker. Think of wet sand versus dry sand for the piping plover. They both have a headband, a black headband, but the semi-palmated plover has those driving goggles, so that nose band and the eye ring, whereas the piping plover does not. And then you do see the difference in the breastband there. So it's a much narrower breastband on the piping plover. And those of you who were paying attention to the pictures I was showing may have noticed that all the pictures of piping plovers feature them wearing leg bands. So those colored bands and that metal band you can see on the piping plover there. And this is because piping plover populations, particularly those in the Atlantic, are intensely monitored because the species is listed as endangered in Canada after some pretty dramatic population declines. The problem for piping plovers is mostly that what they really like is to nest on sandy beaches, which happens to be a habitat that humans also enjoy very much. They like to drive ATVs there, they like to walk their dogs there, they like to set up beach umbrellas and towels and enjoy the sunshine. But equally, unfortunately, piping plovers happen to be extremely sensitive to disturbance. So they're in exactly the wrong habitat for a bird that's very sensitive to disturbance. And if there is enough disturbance by humans or dogs, other predators, adult piping plovers will abandon their nests. So for these guys, habitat loss due to the development and the management of beaches and natural predators are pretty big issues. And Birds Canada does actually have piping plover conservation programs in a number of provinces, including Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And in these provinces, they work with partners to protect nests with fencing and predator exclosure, so they stop things like gulls from getting at the nests. Volunteers will then help monitor the nests and engage beach users to increase awareness about the birds, and hopefully people will keep a little bit of a larger distance from their nest. And as part of this piping plover monitoring program, Birds Canada teams and their partners band the adults and chicks to keep track of productivity. So here in Newfoundland, we don't have a piping plover program, but the piping plover populations here are monitored by the Canadian Wildlife Service, Parks Canada, and a number of other NGOs, including Intervale. All right, so moving from the plovers into the sandpipers, which, as you remember, are the guys with the longer bills that really probe around using their bills. So far, all of the shorebirds we've talked about are pretty rare breeders here in Newfoundland. This guy is very different. The spotted sandpiper is much more common. And I love these guys. I think they're actually my favorite shorebird here in Newfoundland. They're very distinctive in appearance, sound, and activity. So these guys are the most widespread shorebird in North America, and one that you're very likely to come across here in Newfoundland. And although I can find shorebird ID a little bit intimidating, these guys are a great way to get into identifying shorebirds. So they are found almost anywhere near water, and that includes inland along streams and riverbanks and rocky shores. And they're neat also because they display what we call sex role reversal. So in most species of birds, males establish and defend territories, and females provide parental care. And in spotted sandpipers, it's exactly the reverse. So females establish and defend the territory, and males sit on the eggs, and then they shepherd the young around when they hatch. So cues for the spotted sandpiper, well, it's all in the name. You'll notice that spotted, breast, and belly. It's only the case during the breeding season, but it's true of both sexes. So both male and female spotted sandpipers have those polka dots. They have a white wing stripe, which you can see in flight, but you cannot see in this picture. They have a blackish orangish bill and a dark line through the eye, and then they have olive brown legs. And there are a couple of things that make these guys pretty easy to recognize. The first is their song, which is sort of a rapid series of weet 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 calls. So I'm going to play that one for you now. So you're quite likely to hear that while you're out and about near water. And then the other way that's really easy to recognize a spotted sandpiper is by their movements. So they display this sort of unique bobbing behavior, or it can also be called teetering. So they constantly bob their tail up and down as they walk. And they also have a fluttering flight when they do fly that is quite unique. And I just wanted to show you this bobbing behavior. Let's see. Okay, we want to start it. Okay, apparently it's not going to let me go ahead. I wanted to start at 24 seconds, but we'll sit through a little bit of it and wait till he starts bobbing his tail, because it's a very easy way to recognize this sandpiper if you see him in the wild, because it is very characteristic. There you go. There's the tail bobbing, or the teetering. So that would be something you would notice, which would identify it as the spotted sandpiper right away. Okay, next sandpiper up is the least sandpiper. And again, sometimes the ID cues are all in the name. So these guys are the smallest of the shorebirds. They are tiny, tiny sandpipers. They're not really much bigger than a sparrow. And like semi-palmated plovers, these guys are mainly an Arctic breeding shorebird, but they are a rare breeder here in Newfoundland. So these are getting into what birders will often call peeps, which are the smaller shorebirds that run around on beaches. And at least for me, can be very challenging to identify. So cues for these guys. They have yellow-green legs. They have, and that's really, sorry, the yellow-green legs are very important because it's one of the ways you can distinguish them from similar species like semi-palmated sandpipers, although remember that semi-palmated sandpipers do not breed here in Newfoundland. The problem with using the legs, though, as diagnostic is that because shorebirds spend a lot of time running around in mud, their legs are often mud covered. They've got that rusty speckling on the back, and around the back feathers, around the edges, you see white or buff edging. On their throat and chest, they've got some very fine barring. However, that is only during the breeding season. Non-breeding birds have what Cornell defined as a smudgy chest, so you can't see those clear bars. They have a dark bill that is just slightly down curved, not a lot, but it is there if you look for it. And they have this characteristic hunched posture, like with their shoulders up around their ears, and that's how they walk around. Okay, another one of our very, very common sandpipers is the greater yellowlegs. And this is one of the birds that has a fun Newfoundland name. It's known as a twi'lek. It is a bird of the boreal forest, and it tends to wade deeper in the water than many other shorebirds, which could be because it has much longer legs. It's common and it's widespread across North America, but we actually don't know that much about it, largely because, and Jenna and I can both attest to this, it really likes to nest in bug-infested bogs. So people don't have a huge inclination to study it a lot of the time. Again, the name tells you a lot of what you need to know. So you've got those long, bright yellow legs, a very long, sturdy bill. It's got a relatively small head and a slender neck, and it's got barring on its flanks, which sometimes extends all the way around the body. So breeding birds may have more heavily streaked underparts. And these guys also have a couple of distinctive calls, actually. So greater yellowlegs tend to give 2-2-2 calls, and they give these calls in a sequence of 3 or more. So it's sometimes described as if the bird is actually saying its own name, yellowlegs. So I'll play that for you now. So it almost sounded, that last one sounded a bit like he was saying yellow legs. And one of the reasons that I enjoy these guys so much is because of their incredibly loud, incredibly persistent alarm calls. So even though they're a shorebird that looks like they have absolutely no business being at the top of a tree, nonetheless, you will often find them at the top of a tree where they scream alarm calls at you as you walk around their bog for as much as half an hour. So some of the colloquial names for this bird include things like telltale, tattler, and yelper, all of which refer to these alarm calls. So the alarm calls are very monotonous, loud, a little bit like a car alarm. It can be a little bit frustrating if you're out birding, but it's actually also really good evidence of probable breeding. So we were talking about behavioral cues of breeding. Even if you don't see nestlings, you don't see eggs, if a greater yellowlegs is alarm calling at you, he probably has a reason to be doing that. So you can understand how that gets a little frustrating after a while, but it's a good way to know that a greater yellowlegs is around. Now, greater yellowlegs is pretty distinctive shorebird. However, there is a little bit of a wrinkle here, and that is that there is a species known as the lesser yellowlegs, which is unsurprisingly smaller than the greater yellowlegs, but that's really mostly helpful if you happen to have them standing beside each other, and birds aren't normally that cooperative. A couple of things to keep in mind, though. Lesser yellowlegs do not breed in Newfoundland, and they're actually much less common. So they're usually seen migrating through in late summer and early fall. Generally speaking, they're more delicate looking, and other identifying cues for the greater yellowlegs. Remember I said that the markings on the flank of a greater yellowlegs can actually go all the way around at the belly. You see much fewer flank markings on a lesser yellowlegs, and you see a shorter, thinner bill. Again, size is relative, so shorter, thinner bill is maybe not the most helpful thing, but those of you who were there for Jenna's initial beginner birding ID webinar right at the beginning of this series may remember that Jenna talked about using relative size. So one way you can try to determine whether you have a greater or a lesser yellowlegs is by looking at the size of the bill relative to the head. So you can see on the lesser yellowlegs, the bill is approximately the same size as the head, a little bit longer. But when you look at the greater yellowlegs, the bill is actually evidently much longer than the head. So that is a good way to tell the difference between them. You can also tell the difference by voice. So even though they sound quite similar, lesser yellowlegs usually give just a single two call or double, but they don't tend to go to 3 syllables or more the way the greater yellowlegs does. Okay. Another sandpiper we have here, a large sandpiper, is the willet. It's got a large head. It's similar in size to the greater yellowlegs, but it is bulkier or stockier. Remember that greater yellowlegs has a very slender neck and head. These guys are a little bit more of a football player of a bird. They nest quite close to the water's edge, and they're quite vocal when alarmed. They're kind of mottled gray overall with a large, thick bill. They don't have yellow legs, so they've got long, dull-colored legs. Good way to distinguish them from a greater yellowlegs. And really one of the big distinguishing features is those black and white patterned wings. They're pretty indistinct, but when they're in flight, you really notice those wings. That black and white stripe, though, is not visible when the wings are folded. All right, and our last few shorebirds. This is the Wilson snipe. They are a cute little plump bird. They are among the most widespread shorebirds in North America. And these guys are common breeders in Newfoundland. Again, many of our shorebirds are relatively uncommon, but snipe are very common. You can hear them all throughout the spring and summer and in the early evening and at night. But they're often hard to see because they've got very cryptic coloration, so they're good at camouflage. And if they're not perched on an exposed perch like this fence post, they can be pretty tricky. They like to nest near water in shallow wetlands and damp, muddy habitats, and we have lots and lots of damp, muddy habitats for them here. And one of the reasons they really look stocky, you can see this bird is just pretty chubby. Apparently, one of the reasons for this is that they have extra large pectoral muscles, so breast muscles there, that actually make up nearly 1/4 of the bird's weight. So that's the highest percent of all shorebirds. And because they've got these massive flight muscles, they can reach speeds of about 60 miles an hour, which is pretty incredible. And some of you may be wondering about the origin of this name. I can't tell you where snipe came from, but I can tell you that the word sniper actually originated amongst British soldiers in India who hunted snipe as game. So they actually are still hunted in many countries, including the US, where it's legal to hunt them, but they are very fast and erratic flyers, so they can be quite difficult targets. So for these guys, you've got a striped crown, and note, it'll become important when we move to the next bird, that the stripes run parallel to the head, not across. They run the same direction as the bill. They have a very long bill relative to their head size, a white belly, short tail, short legs. They have barring on the flanks, and on their backs, they have 3 buffy stripes. And they've got a large head and a thick neck, and really, it almost looks like no neck at all. So you'll notice that their eyes are set really far back on their heads. And that's because of this, they actually have a much wider field of vision than we do. And these guys, Wilson snipe, can see almost as well behind as in front and to the sides. And this is so that it's very difficult for predators to sneak up on feeding snipe. It actually almost has birds' eyes in the back of its head. And again, these are marsh birds, so it won't surprise you to know that they are more often heard than seen. And they're particularly active at dawn and dusk. They're recognizable by the male flight display primarily, which the male will perform this by circling high overhead and then diving at speed. And as the wind passes over their tail feathers, they make this winnowing noise, which is really, really distinctive. And the only thing that sounds even vaguely familiar, vaguely similar to it, is boreal owl call, which I think Jenna will be covering next week. So this is what a winnowing snipe sounds like. And trust me, when you're out there at dusk, you'll be looking for the source of that sound, and it turns out to be very, very difficult to find a winnowing snipe, but you can hear them very clearly. Okay, and another shorebird, which superficially may seem a little bit similar. Plump. It also has a very long bill, so it's in some ways quite similar to the Wilson snipe. It's got those eyes really far back in its head. However, unlike other shorebirds, woodcocks actually like young forests and scrubby old fields, and their plumage provides excellent camouflage there. Now, these guys are a little bit interesting because we've traditionally thought of them as very rare breeders here in Newfoundland, with a restricted range, again, in that southwest corner and along the west coast. However, because these guys are most active at dusk, it's actually possible they are more common than thought and simply going unnoticed. And in fact, if I'm remembering correctly, Jenna, tell me if I'm wrong, Jenna just actually found an American woodcock in a recording that was taken near Flat Rock on the Avalon. So keep your ears open for these guys. They do make, again, a very distinctive call. So the visual cues, if you happen to see one, they've got those bright cinnamon underparts. They have a long straight bill, gray stripes down the back, and a gray collar. And the males they'll show up for females with a loud nasal peent call, and some fairly dazzling aerial displays. So these guys will actually give the peent call from on the ground, and then they fly upwards in a spiral, unlike the snipe, which flies down in a spiral. And so as they fly up, their wings start to twitter, and then at about 300 feet, the twittering becomes intermittent, and the bird starts to descend and zigzags down. But really what you're going to recognize them by is these peent calls, which are given sort of just after dusk. Oh. So again, the only thing that really sounds similar to that is the call of a common nighthawk. But those are very unusual here in Newfoundland, and so not a mistake that is likely to happen. And I did just want to draw your attention to the striping on the crown of the American woodcock, because the Wilson snipe also has stripes, but whereas those stripes are parallel with the bill, these ones are perpendicular. So they're actually horizontally from eye to eye. They go in a different direction. And I just briefly wanted to, as before we move away from the shorebirds, talk a little bit about shorebird migration in Newfoundland. So we have talked about the breeding birds here, but there are many, many more species you might expect to see here in Newfoundland during the fall migration, because Newfoundland is an important stopover ground for many species. We do also see some migrants in the spring, but not nearly as many, and that's because in the spring, most birds are in a really big hurry to make it to their breeding grounds. So they'll go straight north to the Arctic, through the center of the continent, they bypass Newfoundland completely. But in the fall, on many of the mud flats and along our coastlines, you'll see large mixed flocks of shorebirds feeding on invertebrates, fueling up for their southward journey. And one particularly great place to go is Cape Friels on the northeast coast. It's a great place to go to see migrating shorebirds. However, it's also worth mentioning that many of them are not in breeding plumage when they come back through Newfoundland in the fall, which does make them a little bit more difficult to identify. Okay, so we only have 4 species left, which is good because I think my voice is about to give out here. So we are going to talk primarily about the family Phasianidae. So the pheasants, chicken-like ground-dwelling birds that eat primarily seeds and buds, but also insects. And they have a characteristic takeoff, so it's very explosive with rapid beats, and they've got these stiff, rounded wings. Again, theoretically, game birds would include geese and ducks. Jenna has already told us all about the ducks of Newfoundland, and for convenience's sake, I am going to cover Newfoundland's only breeding goose species today. So our first grouse species here is the ruffed grouse. It is not native to Newfoundland. It was introduced into several areas in the 1960s and 70s to provide game for hunters. These are forest understory birds. They like leaves, buds, and the fruit of deciduous trees. But they are very wary of humans, and they will often wait until people get very, very close before they take off in that explosive way that I just managed, and probably give the person coming close to them a heart attack. This ruffed name, the ruffed grouse, refers to the feather tufts on either side of the bird's neck, which you can see in this photo. And females and males are very similar to each other, but the ruff is less conspicuous on females. These guys are ground nesters, and they are year-round residents here in Newfoundland. Some cues, a really, really good one is that black band you can see at the end of the tail. That is an important cue. They do have a crested head, although you can't really see the crest on this particular individual. They have that ruff around the neck, and then they have dark flank bars, which are also difficult to see in this individual. So the ruff is visible in this picture, but it's usually darker than this one. So this could be a female, which, as I said, has a little bit of a less extensive ruff. This is another bird that is often heard rather than seen. Remember, it's pretty shy of people. So males make a characteristic drumming noise, and they do this using their wings. So they typically stand on a raised surface, such as a stump or a log, and they beat their wings back and forth. And the sound that they make comes not from the wings hitting the body, but basically from creating miniature sonic booms while they pump their wings back and forth. So it sounds a little bit like a helicopter starting up in the forest. And if you ever find yourself thinking, well, there's no way anybody just landed a helicopter here, think ruffed grouse. The sound that they make is actually audible over very long distances. And I've got that to play for you as well. So you can see that it speeds up as it goes. We do have one other grouse species here, which is also introduced. So again, not a native species. It was introduced for game hunters as well. It's a much smaller species of grouse, but it's also much less wary of humans. They can actually seem pretty tame because when they're approached by a predator or a person, they tend to hold still and rely on their camouflage to hide them. And thus they have gained a name here in Newfoundland of fool hen. They like primarily pine and spruce needles in forests, but they also do like blueberries, which we have in ample supply here. So for these guys, the males, you're looking for a black throat and chest, a red eyebrow, gray neck and head, and white spots on the lower belly. So in this particular photo, a male is taking a dust bath. The female spruce grouse, however, looks different. So female spruce grosses, they have barred underparts. They have a short tail. They come in 2 color morphs, so gray and chestnut, and they do look a little bit like ruffed grouse females. So the main differences you're looking for, they are smaller, they have a shorter tail, they don't have a crested head, and they don't have ruff around the neck. And if you are able to see the tail, they do not have that black band at the end of the tail. And this, again, this is a photo included entirely for cuteness factor, but also to throw this out there as incentive to maybe get out atlasing in Newfoundland. Spruce grouse are actually incredibly common here. So in the summer of 2021, the Atlas team found them in virtually all of our survey sites in the southern interior. And we often found them with chicks like this one. So even though they're largely silent, they're quite easy to find. Okay, our last few game birds, the 2 ptarmigan species here in Newfoundland. So unlike our grouse species, the ptarmigan species are native. They were not introduced. The willow ptarmigan is the largest of North America's 3 ptarmigan species. It's relatively common. It's a tundra dweller, but it moves into sheltered valleys for the winter. So here in Newfoundland, it's found on the maritime barrens near the tips of the peninsulas and in open upland areas. So for example, in Gros Morne. This picture is of a breeding male willow ptarmigan. So you've got a red eyebrow, a chestnut neck, you've got that short, stout bill, white belly, the lovely feathered feet, which are characteristic of the ptarmigan, and a little short tail. Interesting note about these guys, the willow ptarmigan is the only grouse in the world in which the male regularly helps to raise the young. So pairs remain together from the beginning of the breeding season until the chicks are independent, which is almost 7 months. Again, we have a dimorphic species. So female willow ptarmigan, they are mottled brown, black, and white during the breeding season. And as you can see, they are very, very camouflaged, especially on the tundra. That photo was actually taken in Alaska. So often these guys don't move until you have your foot in the air over them, and then they explode out from under your foot, sometimes with lots of little willow ptarmigan chicks going in every possible direction. And I believe Jenna had an experience like that this summer. Both male and female ptarmigan turn white in the winter to blend in with their snowy surroundings. Basically, they're just a big white fluffy ball in the winter with their little feathered feet, which function as snowshoes to walk over the snow. They will also excavate snow burrows in which to take shelter from the elements. Okay, and our second ptarmigan, rock ptarmigan. They are mostly Arctic grouse. Newfoundland is the southern extent of their range. And they are similar in appearance to the willow ptarmigan, which is more common. But willow ptarmigan are larger and browner. Rock ptarmigan will spend their entire lives on tundra-like terrain. They'll move a bit closer to the coast in the winter, but they won't go down into those valleys the way willow ptarmigan do. So for the rock ptarmigan, you're looking for a red eyebrow, a short bill, mottled brown back, and a white belly. This is also a good place to look for habitat cues. So unsurprisingly, rock ptarmigan like rocky tundra. Female rock ptarmigan are mottled brown and black with a small red eyebrow. And you can see, again, a plug for the chicks of shorebirds and gamebirds here because these guys are fantastic. These guys also turn white in the winter to blend in with their surroundings. However, unlike the unmarked willow ptarmigan, you'll see a black stripe running from the bill to the eye. And the males in the winter actually will also have a pronounced red eyebrow. So in the winter, it's actually pretty easy to tell the difference between willow ptarmigan and rock ptarmigan. Male rock ptarmigan will actually stay white during their courtship, but females will lose their winter plumage much faster. So after courtship finishes, males will intentionally dirty their feathers to hide from predators until they've fully molted into their brown summer plumage, because you can imagine being bright white on a landscape that is not, maybe makes you a target. All right, just got to survive. One more species. So just to draw your attention to comparisons between the willow and rock ptarmigan, willow males are redder than rock ptarmigan in the summer, and they have that cinnamon head and neck, so that's not the mottled brown of the rock ptarmigan. Rock ptarmigan also have darker backs, so you'll see the willow ptarmigan's back is mostly white, the rock ptarmigan's is darker, if the rock ptarmigans have molted. And then in the winter, you can tell the difference by that absence of any black marking on the face of the willow ptarmigan. Females of the two species are actually extremely difficult to tell apart. Willow ptarmigan females have a stouter bill than rock ptarmigans and are a warmer brown, but again, that's really only useful if you happen to have the two species standing beside each other. So here you can look to habitat as your best cue. So rock ptarmigan, as their name suggests, they tend to occur in barren rocky areas of the tundra. Willow ptarmigan tend to be found in areas with more vegetation. Okay, and we will end with a nice familiar species here today. Most of you have probably seen these guys. I also think this is an appropriate picture for Family Day, which it is in many Canadian provinces today. So this is the Canada goose. You've got an even brown body, black tail, a white chin strap, black head, long black neck. Feels a bit silly to include them. However, it's worth noting that although they're extremely common in much of Canada, including Waterloo, where I grew up, where in fact the University of Waterloo has a group of geese that regularly harass its students and chase them from building to building. However, here in Newfoundland, they are considerably less common. So it's actually unusual to see breeding Canada goose here. All right, and we have a couple minutes left. So we are gonna try this poll thing again, and we're gonna test your knowledge of the shorebirds. So I will put this first guy up. Let's see if we've got this down to a science now. All right, so who is this? All right, we'll give you just a few more minutes for answers to come in. We've got about 50 people who've answered. Anybody want to throw in a couple more guesses? All right, I'm going to end the poll. So by far the majority of you thought it was a piping plover. There we go. Hopefully you can see the results now. And indeed it is. So you see that light sandy gray back. You see that single breastband, but it's almost incomplete here, so it's quite narrow. And you see that black headband, but no eye ring and no noseband. So if it were a semi-palmated plover, you would see the darker eye and the noseband, and the back would be darker. And if it were a killdeer, you would see two breastbands. Luckily, nobody thought it was a sora, even though I called their nose candy corn as well. So well done. All right, our next species here. Okay. All right, so who have we got here?
I'll just jump in and say if the poll is covering the picture, you can just drag the poll around your screen.
Yes,
and it should move around.
All right, any more last minute guesses? No, we've got 60 people who've answered, which is excellent. No, 62. All right, I'm going to end the poll and we'll share these results. So again, the vast majority thought it was a Wilson snipe, and you are correct. That is what it is. A couple people guessed American woodcock, which is understandable. Those are very similar species. What you want to look at here, or one of the big things I look at, is the direction of the stripes on the head. So because these stripes are parallel to the bill, they go vertically across the head. We're looking at a snipe. A woodcock would have stripes between the eyes, like it was wearing a little headband. A bittern is also not a bad guess, but with a bittern, not only would it be a bigger bird, and size is hard to tell in a photo, but also you would expect a much longer neck. Okay. So our next bird species. All right, who have we got here? All right, we've got over 50 participated, which is kind of the limit I'm going for. If there's anybody else who wants to add in their 2 cents, throw in your guesses now. All right. So 80% of you thought it was a Virginia rail. You are correct. This is a Virginia rail. So you've got that orange and black bill. Unlike the Sora's bright yellow candy corn bill, so shorter and thicker bill, you've got a gray cheek instead of a black face mask. A woodcock, again, you would expect to see that headband of stripes over its head. And a willet is essentially not a terribly distinctive shorebird unless it has its wings up, and then it's got that black and white plumage. All right, I have just a few more. Okay. This one's a bit of a tricky one. All right. Last call for guesses. And remember, this is completely anonymous, so throw your guesses in there. All right. So people were a little bit more split on this one, and with good reason, because this is a tricky one. So this is indeed a willet, which I just said was a fairly not particularly distinct shorebird, and that's exactly what this guy is. So remember, that black and white on the wings is only visible when he's in flight. When he's got his wings folded, it's tucked away. We can rule out yellow legs pretty much right away because you can see the top of his legs here and they are not yellow. So that takes out both of our species of yellow legs. Spotted sandpipers are a little bit more delicate looking, and you would see distinct spots on the breast rather than this sort of mottled streaking. So this is a willet. Okay. And who do we have here? Okay, people seem pretty split on this one too. And I'm going to be honest with you, I struggle with these guys as well. So this is a spruce grouse. You can see there's no dark band at the end of its tail, no ruff, no crest on its head. So it is not a ruffed grouse. It doesn't have that cinnamon neck. It is not a willow ptarmigan either. All right. How many of these did I put in here? I think we've got a couple extra today. We have 3 more. All right, so who do we have here? All right, it seems to be slowing down. So last few guesses coming in. All right, I'm going to end poll, share our results. So 93% of you said it was an American bittern. That is indeed what it is. So you see these distinctive stripes along the neck. Remember, when he's standing with his head back and pointed up, these blend in very nicely with the vegetation. Some of you said Sora, and again, the posture is actually not bad for a Sora, but you would expect a much smaller little candy corn bill there and a black face mask. Great blue heron, you've got the right group of birds. He is a heron. but you would expect dark plumes on the back of the head, shaggy breast feathers, and you would expect him to have grayish blue plumage. Okay, 2 more. And oh no, sorry, this is the last one. I lied. This is our last one today. All right. Throw in your guesses now. Okay, we've got more than 80% of people threw in a guess. Excellent. All right, we'll stop it there. Share the results. So almost 75% of people thought that it was a greater yellow legs. This is indeed correct. So you can just see, this is a bit of a tricky photo because you can just see the tops of the yellow legs there. Most of it is underwater, but remember, yellow legs do actually tend to go further out in water when they wade than other shorebirds. It's not a spotted sandpiper because we don't have those spots on the breast. It is too big for a least sandpiper. The bill is too large. You've got those yellow legs, which is quite different. Lesser and greater yellow legs, that's a little bit of a nightmare. But in this case, the bill is longer than the head as opposed to approximately the same length. So greater yellow legs it is. All right, so that is it for today. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'd be happy to try and answer any of your questions. And there's our contact information there. I hope that you will join us next week for our next webinar in this series. And for those of you who are interested in getting a little bit more bird practice in today, I will just note that Nature NL, which is one of our partner organizations, they are doing a bird learning night on this Wednesday, the 22nd. So this is an online event, and what they do is some of the best birders here on the island go through an eBird quiz online and discuss, well, basically they do what we just did, but the pictures are all from eBird, and you never know what's coming up. So it can be a great way to get in some practice with your birds, and I highly recommend going.
Thanks,
All right,
Catherine.
Jenna, do we have anything from the chat?
There's been a couple questions as we went along that I answered in the chat. So just for people who weren't reading it, there was a question about whether ruffed grouse drum year round or if it's only in the spring, and they do indeed drum year round, but it's more common in the spring. So they'll get a little bit more intent about that. And then someone else asked if grouse have a winter plumage, a white plumage like the ptarmigan do, and they keep their same plumage year round. So those were a couple of questions in the chat. And some people are asking for the link.
You also want to keep in mind where the birds are, because the willow and the rock ptarmigans are much more likely to be on exposed tundra, whereas grouse tend to be forest birds.
Absolutely. There's lots of thank yous and people love the little chicks. And then maybe in the follow-up email, we'll be sure to send the link for the Nature NL event.
Yes.
But you could find it on, somebody says in the chat here, the Nature NL Facebook page, it's posted there.
It is, yes. All right, well, if that's it for questions, I'll just say thank you all again for coming out tonight. Sorry that we went a little bit long, but I'm glad you stuck with us, and we'll see you next week.
Great, thanks so much, Catherine. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jenna. Good night.